Good afternoon, everyone, and Team MGO, and thank you for your patience. MGO's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion team is pleased to welcome you to February's Coffee and Conversation celebrating Black History Month with Dr. Cornel West. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. You're listening in using your computer speaker system by default. If you would prefer to join over the phone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send your questions in at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation, time permitting. At the conclusion of today's presentation, you will be given the opportunity to conduct a brief survey. Please take a few moments to offer your feedback. And now, without further ado, I would now like to introduce you to Ken Goldman, partner with MGO.
Thank you, Jen. Dr. Cornel West has written, and I quote, "Without hope, there can be no future. Without meaning, there can be no struggle." This statement captures the essence of Dr. West's humanistic approach to the big questions of life that are politics, race, culture, and religion. He has shaped and shared his unique perspective through his role as professor of the practice of public philosophy at Harvard University, as professor emeritus at Princeton University, as the author of 20 books, and as a frequent guest on programs like The Bill Maher Show, CNN, C-SPAN, and Democracy Now! In his career as a leading public intellectual, he has been unafraid of courting controversy. His oftentimes raw takes on divisive issues may ruffle feathers throughout the political spectrum, but he always speaks truth to power in pursuit of a higher good. I've had the pleasure of knowing Dr. West for over 13 years. It has been gratifying to watch his career evolve while he stays true to his purpose of keeping alive the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr., a legacy of telling the truth and bearing witness to love and justice. This afternoon, Dr. West will be interviewed by Morgan Stinson, one of MGO's most promising young leaders. In the past year, Morgan has carved out an integral role for our firm, both as a leader of the MGO Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Initiative, and also as a co-creator of the Future Game, MGO's platform for increasing financial education for athletes and others from disadvantaged communities. MGO is committed to providing a platform for conversations that educate and inspire reflection. And we can think of no better commemoration of Black History Month than this event. I'd now like to welcome Dr. Cornel West and Morgan Stinson.
Thank you, Ken. And welcome everybody from MGO. This is our first Coffee and Conversations brought to you by our Diversity and Inclusion Initiative. And I am so happy to be here to celebrate Black History Month with Dr. Cornel West. I am your host, Morgan Stinson. And Dr. West, can you hear me?
Oh, indeed. I can hear your lovely voice. I heard the lovely voice of Brother Ken, too.
Welcome. So first, I would like to discuss the role that diversity and inclusion programs play in an organization like ours. Too often, there is a perception that these programs are used to check a box or meet a quota, but that is not what we value here in improving our operations. Can you address the importance of cultivating culture within an organization, and especially the real value that a corporate culture built on inclusion and representation across all levels means to us?
Indeed. First, let me just thank you so very much, my dear sister Morgan. It's a blessing to be in conversation with you. MGO is very blessed to have you. Words fail and language falls short for my love and respect for Brother Ken. These 13 years, he's come to the rescue in so many different ways and different fronts, and I do want to be able to express my gratitude to him publicly as I have privately. And similarly so for Sister Sherry. I mean, she's just a gem. She's a jewel. She's come to the rescue in so many different ways at the highest level of professionalism. Sister Jeannie, the exact same words go to her. I consider MGO as an extension of my family in terms of allowing me in my own fallible and finite way to try to be true to my calling. And so I think when you talk about diversity within the corporate culture, you have to begin on a spiritual and a moral plane. And as you know, Sister Morgan, this is the best of Black history. You know, when you've been hated for 400 years, and you try to produce love warriors. When you're traumatized for 400 years, you try to produce wounded healers. And when you're terrorized for 400 years, you try to produce freedom fighters. And therefore, you start with the virtues. You want a corporate culture that's fundamentally committed to integrity, spiritual and moral integrity, honesty, decency. You want humanity to be affirmed so we can learn how to revel in our distinctive humanities in the corporate culture so that, yes, we're still able to do well and do good simultaneously. You're able to be competitive financially and economically, but not or without losing your soul. And you preserve your soul when you stay in contact with the humanity of others. And so in that sense, there is a built-in commitment to integrity, honesty, decency when we're talking about equity and diversity. And that's very important because if we get too obsessed with skin color and gender and don't ground it in what the corporate culture is all about, which is what? Which is excellence, integrity, honesty, fairness, accountability.
Yes.
And you let me know if I'm going on too long, my dear sister. I'm so sorry I can't be there. Sister Jennifer was magnificent. She's wonderful. She did all that she could, but something's wrong with my iPad here in the snow here in Princeton, New Jersey. So
it's okay. We can hear your voice, and that's the most important part.
Well, that's good. That's good. I appreciate it.
So our next question is, you've said that structure and behavior are inseparable, and that conversations around institutions are focused on or masked by economics and politics, but not culture. How can we reshape the conversation to elevate the importance of culture and ethical issues?
Yes. Well, you know, I didn't get a chance to salute the captain of the ship. I'm talking about brother CEO Kevin O'Connor, because leadership does matter. Leadership sets a tone. Leadership is a thermostat rather than a thermometer. So you're really shaping the climate of opinion. You're shaping the discourse rather than just reflecting the discourse and reflecting the climate of opinion. And I think when we talk about visionary, courageous leadership, and MGO has had to have courageous and visionary leadership in order to sustain itself and in order to ensure that the potential and possibility of each and every precious employee is accented and affirmed. It's almost like a jazz orchestra where you've got everybody lifting their voice, bouncing off against one another. Of course, there's hierarchy, but the hierarchy is mediated by both merit and accountability. And at the same time, you're trying to create a cacophony of voices so that MGO can sing together, not just in harmony, because Black people, we're blues people. You need some dissonance. You need some minor notes in there, you know? You need some B flats and C minors.
Yes. It reminds me of Lift Every Voice and Sing. How
Absolutely.
Yes, exactly what you said.
See, that's exactly what I had in mind, my dear sister. That's the anthem of Black folk. Not lift every echo, but it's lift every voice. And the echo is just an extension of an echo chamber, professionally, politically, ideologically. Find your voice like Sarah Vaughan, like John Coltrane, like Stevie Wonder, like Carole King, like Stephen Sondheim, like the Righteous Brothers. Everybody who's serious about what it means to be human has got to find their voice. And your voice is just like a fingerprint. It is only yours, and you take it to the grave with you.
Yes. Well, I appreciate, your references to how those things that are embedded in our culture are still prevalent in how we carry ourselves today. So we've talked a little bit about, you and I before, how inclusion is not an afterthought. It's something that you don't get the option to buy in or opt into. How do we further the acceptance that diversity and inclusion is essential to building a great firm that does great things?
Absolutely, because the last thing you ever want to do is to view diversity or inclusion as some kind of fringe activity, some kind of ghettoized sensibility. It is integral of or integral with the most fundamental end and aim of the firm itself. And as I said before, the fundamental end and aim of the firm is to do well and do good.
Yes.
You want to do well financially, but you want to be a force for good. Force for good always has a moral and spiritual dimension to it. And therefore, when we're talking about inclusion and diversity, it's not secondary or tertiary. It's just like a university. University's quest for truth. Condition of truth is to allow suffering to speak. Everybody's suffering speaks to shape the quest for truth. No one group or person has the possession of truth. We're in pursuit of that truth. So it is with integrity, honesty, decency, diversity, equity, inclusion. We're in pursuit of it. It is an endless pursuit, but we have to be accountable. We got to check on each other and make sure we're moving in the right direction. And this is why we need each and every voice, no matter what gender, sexual orientation, binary or non-binary, Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, Muslim, Arab, whatever. It's got to be a human affair all the way down in the firm itself.
Wow. That's impactful. And you keep using a phrase that I've heard my CEO use about doing good and doing well. It's not it's a phrase that, you know, it can get echoed out sometimes. So I appreciate you platforming that. So I got a chance to read your book, Race Matters. And in your book,
thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah, and in your book, you discuss that there is a need for a new generation of leaders to further the evolution of society. What role do these leaders play, and what are some key characteristics that they need to be fully successful?
Well, I think I speak as a much older brother. You know what I mean? I'm old school. I really am. I'm a Luther Vandross and Curtis Mayfield and Aretha Franklin. I appreciate Rihanna and some of the others, but I'm holding on. I'm holding on to old school. And there's the best of old school, and there's the worst of old school. There's the best of new school, there's the worst of new school. But one of the difficult things for the younger generation is that younger generation has grown up in a context in which it's much more difficult for them to be able to gain access to non-market values, to know what love really is at its deepest level, to know what trust, to know what integrity really is at its deepest level. I have young folk come into my office all the time. Well, Brother West, my brand is, what is your brand? I don't have a brand. I have a cause and a mama. You see, I come from a black folk who were branded when they got off those slave ships and moved into the auction. So that, of course, we all have to have certain strategies and certain ways in which we deal with the markets. Markets are inescapable. They're unavoidable. That they can actually do some very positive things in terms of innovation and breakthroughs, but they also can be fetishized and they can become idols. And the last thing you ever want is to view your life as worshiping an idol or a golden calf. So if you view life as a golden calf, you worship a gold. You view life as a gold rush. I know I'm talking about folks from California. Then you're going to end up worshiping a golden calf. So you have to be able to situate and contextualize brand, market, financial prosperity, but never forget magnanimity. That's what I tell young folk all the time. Magnanimity is greatness, moral and spiritual greatness. Prosperity is financial success. Success is a beautiful thing, but success itself can become an idol if you don't use it for moral and spiritual greatness. You see the distinction I'm trying to make here?
Yes.
It's a very difficult thing, I think, in a culture that has tried to convince persons. I get this at Harvard all the time, where the young folk want to be the smartest in the room and the richest. I say, well, let the phones be smart. You got to be wise and courageous.
Yes.
You can be rich spiritually as well as have financial success. But in the end, life, being human, has to do with the things that are not necessarily in your pocketbook
Yeah.
or in your house. It has to do with the quality of who you are as a human being, your character, your virtues, your values, and the moral and spiritual vision that informs your professional work. So again, Brother Kevin talks about, CEO Brother Kevin talks about it doing good and doing well. I like the dialectical interplay that he's putting forward there.
Yes. And you said something really important. Outside of moral and spiritual maturity, you said that the real benchmark for a true leader is humility. Can you expound on that a little bit? Why is humility such an essential characteristic of a leader?
Well, one is that humility goes hand in hand with an acknowledgement of forces bigger than you. You didn't give birth to yourself. People who did, they just living lives of deception. Love pushed their mama, got them out. They didn't teach themselves a language. They were shaped and molded by something bigger than them. I always say, I am who I am because somebody loved me, somebody cared for me, somebody tended to me, somebody sacrificed for me. And therefore, I have a certain piety. And piety is simply acknowledging the sources of good in our life from womb to tomb. And humility is about that piety. It's about acknowledging what was in place before you were here. The great Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who I've written so much about, talks about this in terms of remembrance, reverence, and resilience. So you have to remember what was in place. Remember who gave you the love and the affirmation. And then you revere something bigger than you. Now, you can be agnostic and atheistic about it and simply say it's some ideal. Or it could be beauty, or it could be dad, or it could be your sibling, or it could be your spouse, something bigger than you that takes you out of your ego, takes you out of your narcissism, takes you out of your adolescent hedonism, and ties you to something that has a spiritual and moral content and substance. And that's one of the ways we have resilience. So humility is the benchmark, as you say, of spiritual maturity. Arrogance is the benchmark of spiritual immaturity, personal insecurity. And you're posing, you're posturing, you're masking, you're disguising that insecurity in the form of arrogance. And so all of the great moral traditions and spiritual traditions of the species always talk about humility here. And I think they're right.
Yeah, I do too. So back to issues on race, equality, and inclusion, which unfortunately, Dr. West, you know all too well, can be polarizing. How can leaders in our organization and at large bridge the gap and change the dialogue to be less about political affiliations and more about universal concepts that you just outlined, like morality and justice and human experiences? How can we reshape that conversation?
Yes. I mean, one is to acknowledge that everybody's who they are, not somebody else. Now, myself, even as a Christian, I believe that each and every one of us are made in the image and likeness of God. This is true for my Jewish brothers and sisters who hold on to Torah. This is true for Muslims as well. This is true for secular folk who believe in an equality and a singularity of each and every member of the species. And if we take that seriously, the question becomes not trying to abolish difference and diversity and heterogeneity, but making sure that that difference and heterogeneity and diversity does not lose sight of the individuals who we are interacting with. You see, part of the problem is that we have these abstract categories: black, white, woman, male, gay, lesbian, or whatever it is. And it's hard to stay in contact with the rich singularity and individuality of fellow human beings who happen to be different colors, different genders, different sexual orientation. So that you have to be able to zero in on that individuality of the human being, even given the long, very ugly history, as you know, Sister Morgan, of white supremacy, male supremacy, all of the various ideologies that lose sight of the humanity of people, the anti-Arab, anti-Jewish, anti-Muslim, anti-Catholic, it goes on and on, anti-indigenous peoples and so forth. And that's most of human history have been shot through with those ideologies.
Yes.
All the way up to 2021. And I'm not just talking about, Capitol, January 6th, that's some kind of aberration. No. Organized hatred and institutionalized greed and indifference and callousness is a fundamental feature of the species going back as far as we know. And our challenge is to create interruptions of that dominant tendency in our history. And those interruptions are created by people who are fundamentally committed to integrity, honesty, decency, love, justice, fairness, accountability, and answerability. And those are always weak in any moment in the history of our species. So we have to strengthen them. They're only strengthened by example. In the corporate context, this is true at home, it's true on the streets, it's true in our different temples and churches and synagogues and so forth, as well as our trade unions. It's true in the suites of corporate culture. It's true on the streets of reservations or barrios or the hood. Human beings are there. The challenge is create interruptions of hatred, contempt, envy, resentment, even though they're always already working inside of us and in our larger structures.
And, I think that a lot of it comes from, just conversations and communication. And a lot of people have shied away from conversations around, race equality, social justice, and things that affect our everyday lives. But how do we make sure that these are conversations and discussions where we welcome ideas and different perspectives, rather than arguments about who's right and who's wrong and what's the right thing and what's the wrong thing? I don't think that is constructive to some of these discussions. So how do we make sure that they don't lead to arguments?
Well, your question is such an important question, especially given what you had talked about earlier in terms of the polarization. But I think we have to proceed on the notion, at least I try to, in my own fallible way, that no opinion or no deed exhausts the humanity of another person. You see, so that if I confront, Brother Rush Limbaugh, for example, I agree with Rush probably about 0.5% of the time. But I guess we both agree that the earth is not flat. Okay, we got some things to work with. He loves his mama, I do too. Oh, we got some solidarity there. Indeed. But whatever Brother Rush says or does that deeply upsets me, that creates righteous indignation at what he says and what he does, that doesn't fully exhaust his humanity. There's something more that's still there. And if that's the case, then that means that there's some possibility of connection. I mean, he's from Kansas City. I love Kansas City. We can sit down and talk about Kansas City before we get into politics. You see what I mean? We can talk about his family. I talk about my family before we get into him pointing out what he thinks I'm wrong, where I think he's wrong. Now, I'm a libertarian. I fight for his right to be wrong as long as he doesn't get injurious harm, because it's very important that people raise their voices and not necessarily agree with me. But there's got to be ways in which love and friendship is not reducible to politics. We have to find something in the humanity of other people that's not reducible to agreement on public policy, for example. But that doesn't mean we're not honest about the disagreement. We've got to be honest, but there's still something about human beings such that we can find something to affirm in who they are. I give you a good example. When I was in Charlottesville, and you had some real sick Vanilla Brothers, oh, they were cussing us out, and calling us all kind of names, N-word and so forth. And I noticed when I walked by the park there in Charlottesville that the KKK and the neo-Nazis, they were playing a little Motown music. And I said, ooh, this is only in America. Isn't that something? They listening to Motown and they want to kill me. And they want to kill Jewish brothers and sisters. And they want to kill so-called minorities. Well, they've been shaped in America. The black music still connects with them, but they have a hatred of the people who produce the music.
Yeah.
So that when we confront each other, if we had a chance just to engage in a off-the-cuff conversation, I would have said, "Oh, that Marvin Gaye show sounding good. I see y'all in the Marvin too." I said, "That doesn't look like you really learned the lesson of Marvin. He's talking about love. He's a love warrior, just like Martin King and John Coltrane and Nina Simone. He's a love warrior. But I see that you have a certain connection to that music. Well, there's something in their humanity that's not reducible to just the full scale, every moment, every second of their lives, hatred of black folk and Jewish folk and others."
Yeah.
And that's a difficult thing to keep track of, but it's very important. Now, of course, I'm dealing with neo-Nazis and Klan. So, these are folk who, thank God, are not the majority in the country. We've got too many of them in the country, too many fellow citizens who are, but they're nowhere near a majority. And if we can stay in contact with their humanity, even given their hatred and contempt, then I think we can do that with fellow citizens, and certainly do that with fellow workers on the job. And then when it comes to MGO, I mean, good God Almighty, all the good folk you all have. I know you're not perfect. I don't want to romanticize you, but you've just got people who I've met at MGO are just been magnificent human beings, the Kens and the Sherrys and the Janines. And I haven't had a chance to really meet Brother Kevin, but I know he wouldn't be CEO without having some deep similarities to Brother Ken and Sister Janine
And I couldn't
and
agree
Sister
more.
Sherry.
That's why I'm still here and have been here. And growing this here is really important to me because of the people that I have been able to work with and meet since joining MGO. So and what you said about
Beautiful.
Motown is super important because I'm from Detroit, Michigan, where Motown was born.
Yes.
Life into so many different people, but it's important because it did create a sense of connection across all races in the city of Detroit. So we could all enjoy the music and dance and be together. So I do agree there's so many connections that we can draw from music and the morality and spirit that comes from it.
That's so very true. So very true.
I have one more topic to cover before we open the floor so that people can ask you some questions. The evolution of the Black experience. In the last year, the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and so many others seem to shine a spotlight on physical trauma of Black Americans. But it also created a new level of emotional and psychological trauma for Black people, stemming not only from seeing our Black brothers and sisters brutalized on TV, but also from receiving a lot of unwanted attention, even if it was coming from a good place. Strangers, as you probably know, were reaching out and checking in and starting conversations about racial issues and topics in spaces that it had never been discussed before. What advice, Dr. West, do you have for Black people and our allies for navigating these layers of disconnection and processing this emerging discourse?
Well, let me say your questions have been high quality, Sister Morgan. I can tell you that very much so. I appreciate them. I think we've got to begin on the premise that no evil should surprise us, just as no despair should paralyze us. So when we see Brother Floyd Jr. Publicly lynched, we shouldn't think that somehow this is some grand aberration or abnormality that America itself doesn't have a history of indigenous peoples, dispossessed of land, bodies violated, slavery and Jim Crow for black people, the sending of the Chinese back after helping build the railroad with the Irish. Every nation state in the modern world has been tied to some form of domination and in many ways some form of barbarism. We don't know of a nation state that has it. You see, I think a lot of times we in America, we think, well, we beacon of liberty, the city on the hill. We're different than every other nation. We're human beings like every other place. What makes us different is that we have a distinctive, fragile democratic experiment that needs to be reaffirmed every generation, or we lose it. And America could be as full of hatred and resentment, just as America could go fascist or authoritarian like any other democratic experiment. And the only reason why we've had those moments where we've overcome civil war, for example, or the 60s and 1960s, or the 1930s and Depression, is that we've had a wave of Americans who have come forth in the name of integrity, honesty, decency, fairness, and democratic possibility. And if you don't generate that over and over again, you're going to lose it. So the first thing we have to recognize is that Floyd, what we saw with Brother Floyd, is a peak of an iceberg.
Yeah.
Peak of an iceberg, you see. And and I know, it's not confined to the black community. We black folk disproportionately have to deal with this kind of brutality. But you got police killing Spanish-speaking brothers and sisters. You got police killing whites, mainly poor whites as well. And each life is equally precious. So that in that sense, we say, well, how do we then fortify ourselves? Now, what do I mean by fortify? Get yourself intellectually, morally, politically, and spiritually equipped to be a force of integrity and a force for good. You see, that's the bottom line. And that then makes you anti-racist. But anti-racist is not your major identity. No, your fundamental identity is a person of integrity with solidarity with others, no matter who they are. So that any talk about identity that's not grounded in moral and spiritual integrity and not tied to a solidarity across race and gender and national boundaries is going to be too narrow.
Yeah.
And that's the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. You see, that's the legacy of Fannie Lou Hamer. That's the legacy of John Coltrane's Love Supreme. And that's the one we want to hold on to. No group, no individual has a monopoly of that kind of commitment to love and freedom and justice and integrity and honesty and decency. And you've got to work at it. Nobody's born with integrity. No matter how pretty your baby actually is, you got to teach that little precious baby integrity. No baby is born decent. I mean, Rousseau and others tried to argue, no, these babies are narcissistic. They think they're the center of the world. You got to teach them gratitude. You got to teach them that they have debts to pay for people who are sacrificing for them. Same is true with justice. No baby's born just. You got to teach them about justice and so forth. Teach them how to love. Of course, they're taught how to love by receiving love, first and foremost. Yes. So those are the things that need to be highlighted, especially at this moment when our democracy is in such deep trouble, given the spiritual decay and moral decrepitude that is pervasive in the country.
Yeah. And like you said, all minorities here throughout American history have gone from the slave to the help to finding and creating positions in leadership. And this progress shows, how tenacious the human spirit is. Can you talk a little bit about the tenacity that it takes for the human spirit to overcome, oppression and racism, and not move towards, having moral outrage or hateful anger and seeking revenge.
Right, right. Well, one is, though, you have to begin with a commitment to truth. The condition of truth is to allow everybody suffering to speak. And it's true. You see, race in the making of America has had a much more difficult time than ethnicity.
Mm-hmm.
See, when the Irish brothers and sisters and the Italian brothers and sisters, Jewish brothers and sisters, when they came to America, they had some vicious forms of discrimination. There's no doubt about that. But when they got on the Jim Crow train, they weren't told to go to the back.
Right.
So there was black and white. That was a divider. So that the ethnicity had its own forms of obstacles and impediments. But the racial divide cut so very deep that if you had a white or a Jewish or Italian brother or sister that go to the back of the bus with the black folk, you could be rest assured that they were pretty spiritually mature and morally and politically committed. You know what I mean? Because they giving up a whole lot of benefits. They're not in the front part of that Jim Crow bus. They giving up some benefits. And there's always been white brothers and sisters who've been willing to do that. But it's very difficult to sustain that over a long period of time. So that the impediments and obstacles that you're talking about when it comes to race have been difficult. This is also true in terms of class. Also true in terms of class, that the black millionaires are living much better than white brothers and sisters in Appalachia. So the class is still a very important obstacle to talk about. And we know gender, my God, gender. You know better than I about the gender obstacles of gender, black and or brown and woman. And then we got to make sure our gay brothers and lesbian sisters and trans and non-binary are treated with respect and their precious humanity is being affirmed too. And a lot of people say, oh, well, Brother West, that sounds like political correctness, PC. I said, no, this is a moral and spiritual commitment that we have to have. And it's fundamental for any democratic project. Because once you get polarization and then gangsterization with paranoia and hysteria, you are going to get clashes which are cultural, political, as well as economic clashes that can undercut your democracy. And we've already seen examples of that in the last few years.
We definitely have. Well, Dr. West, I have one more question I could ask you, but I also want to take a little time. I'm going to start asking questions from the audience. So please submit your questions if you have any, and I will share them with Dr. West. Okay, we have one, so I'll go ahead and ask those questions because I'm sure you have some responses, and I don't want to run out of time. I want people to be able to ask their questions.
And I know you all work hard and so forth. MGO got some of the hardest working folk out. No doubt about that. But if you have a little time extra, I go with the spirit. You know that, Sister Morgan. So don't think we got to go on mechanical time tied to the clock. Though if it spills over, that's fine with me. I got time.
Okay, cool. Well, okay, we have our first question from Renee Parker. She's a partner in our Long Island office in New York. She asks, what would you say to those in the organization that feel that the DEI initiative is a way of reverse discrimination?
No. The DEI is to ensure that we get the highest quality. And for too long in the history of the country, high quality black folk, high quality brown folk, high quality indigenous peoples, high quality women were overlooked. So that diversity is inseparable from quality. And anytime you have a pool of the qualified, you just want to make sure that you're not blinded by any narrow lens or blinded by any narrow criteria, I should say. And the history of the nation is one in which highly qualified black and brown folk and women and others have been overlooked. There's no doubt about that. But unfortunately, a lot of times when people think of diversity, they just automatically think of less qualified. And that's what has to be called into question. That quality goes hand in hand with diversity. It's very important.
Yeah, that's why we stress the importance of like unconscious bias, because a lot of people don't realize that they just have those thoughts that they don't pay attention to and figure out how to dissect them. That's why we run into issues of people misperceiving initiatives like this as a little bit of divisive, and it's really not to be. Okay, we have another question. Eric Parker asks, what kind of advice can you give to young Black youth in regards to balancing their financial wealth with their spiritual wealth?
Well, I think that it's very important for young Black people to recognize that they come from a people who have been on intimate terms with catastrophe, that at our best responded with high levels of compassion and creativity. And this is true not only in the arts. You talked about the music before, the love warriors and the wounded healers among our artists, but also among our parents and grandparents. Mm-hmm. I've been blessed, I think my own family, I can never be the high quality human beings that my mother and father exemplified to me. So I know what the standards are. And so for young Black people, your standards have to be standards of moral and spiritual excellence that I hope you've already experienced even before you have to deal with the so-called mainstream. And don't ever view yourself through the lens of others as your primary perspective. So you view yourself through the lens of the best that has gone into you. Now, keep in mind that the best that has gone into you is not exclusively one race, right, at all. You know what I mean? That because you could be obsessed with Shakespeare if you're a poet. Right? I mean, Toni Morrison was preoccupied with William Faulkner as being the great literary genius that she was, but she understood his genius too. So her writings is very influenced by a brother from Jim Crow, Mississippi, with white supremacist sensibilities, but his literary genius was something she could still pull from, being from Jim Crow, Georgia, and Jim Crow, Ohio, where she was from. So in that sense, young Black folk, make sure you are in contact with the best of your past, the best of your present, and headed toward a better future.
That's impactful. Chris Lenz from our Los Angeles office asks, when building a better future, how do we decide what institutions to tear down and which to reshape to move forward? Ooh, I like that question, because there's a lot of tear down discussions or defund discussions. So how do we decide, Dr. West?
Well, I mean, tearing down is a metaphor as well. It could be something literal as well, but it's a metaphor. It has to do with what are we trying to stamp out. If we look inside of our own hearts and we see too much cowardliness and hatred, that needs to be torn down. That needs to be stamped out. If we see too much hatred at work, in institutions, see too much indifference, callousness in institutions, if we see too much greed in our own hearts, if we see too much greed, that it needs to be called into question. So that, when people look at the police department, you say, okay, now what system of law enforcement do we want to have? We want to make sure that it is affirming the dignity of people. We want to make sure it's protecting people. We want to make sure it's serving people. We know that it was, 1033, the bill that helped militarize the police departments, made it more and more difficult for there to be the kind of relations between community and police, because it seemed as if force, it seemed as if violence was more readily resorted to. And therefore people say, well, defund means what? Defund really means at its highest level to make sure that the police are actually good servants rather than bad masters. Because you have to have people who are serving and protecting and so forth and so on, but you got to make sure that their conception of themselves is not one in which they can do anything, treat people anyway, and get away with it, especially by resorting to force too prematurely. You see, there has to be ways in which you deal with poverty, decrepit schools, unavailable health care, not enough decent housing. There has to be funds and resources for those things, along with the right kind of security. In the end, that's what defunding police means. But I mean, it gets flattened out, of course, in the social media, in corporate media these days. All of these phrases get weaponized in a very ugly and negative way, rather than understood in a nuanced and subtle way. But that's part of our problem as a culture. It's just hard to find context where you can have dialogues grounded in trust and keep track of the complexity of the issue.
Social media has definitely changed a lot of conversations to go from impactful and actually making change to just being, a quick little snippet into what people are interested into, and then they move on to the next thing. So I agree.
It's true.
One more question thus far, and we have some time, so maybe we can get a couple more in. Nick Sanchez from our Los Angeles office wants to get Dr. West's thoughts on the meaningfulness of corporations, etc., making gestures such as moving mascots, for example, like Aunt Jemima, and whether it is posturing and provides real benefit, or if you feel it's meaningless and more polarizing.
Yeah, I think that we have to draw a distinction between different kinds of concessions. Concessions can be symbolic. Concessions can be substantive. Concessions can be both. So that, for example, you take down the Confederate flag, Mississippi, South Carolina, what have you. I support that. It's very important. It's not hitting the issue of poverty. It's not hitting the issue of decrepit schools and joblessness and so forth, but it's still symbolic. Very important. Why? Because there has to be ways in which a status quo that thought that it could wave a flag that represented a violent insurrection overthrow the U.S. government to ensure that black people lived as slaves in perpetuity. That's in the Constitution of the Confederate. That's what Jefferson Davis and Alexander Stephens were committed to as president and vice president. That needs to be called into question. There's no doubt about that. But it's still symbolic, though. You see what I mean? So if you become too obsessed with it, or think when you bring the flag down, somehow you got some major revolutionary act, and all you got to do is walk in the black community and see folk ain't got no food,
right? And
they're homeless, then well, one is something symbolic, and that's crucial, but we need something more substantive.
Yes.
And so I don't believe in either or. I believe in both and, but we have to be able to make that distinction, really. Same would be true with corporate culture, is that corporations are not monolithic. There's a lot of different kind of corporations. There are some corporations who are just downright too greedy.
I agree.
And are accountable simply to a small group of people who want to make more money, more money, more money. There are other corporations that say, no, we're going to make money, but we have social responsibility, and we're going to be not just persons of integrity. We're not going to sell our souls for a mess of financial pottage. You see, what does that mean? And then, and so that you've got these different kinds of institutions. All of them have to play the same larger game of being tied into a capitalist system concerned with profits. Absolutely. But there has to be ways in which they conceive of themselves as ensuring that there is a strong spiritual moral dimension so that they will make a concession. Now, for some people, they'll have their hearts in it. For other people, it would be PR activity. Well,
Yeah.
our backs are against the wall and we don't want to go against the grain, and therefore we'll do this. Well, see, that's a different kind of leadership. Different kind of leadership. But the important thing is not to engage in any kind of monolithic or homogeneous characterization of either groups or institutions. Institutions are very different. There's a lot of different kind of churches out there, right? Some of them headed by prosperity gospel, market-driven pastors. Others headed by pastors who love their people, who balance trying to make money to keep the church going with serving the people. The same is true of the corporation. You got certain kind of temples out there. You got certain kind of synagogues out there. You got certain the different kinds. Some of them are more prophetic than others. That's part and parcel of keeping track of our humanity inside of all of these institutions. Same would be true with the mosque. Same would be true for trade unions.
Yeah, and you've highlighted on this. There's a question here that says, what can a company like ours do in current times where people are calling for action and not for talk? And I think you kind of answered that. You said how we can go beyond and actually be a vessel and a tool in the community. But would you care to elaborate any more on that, or do you feel like I feel like you answered that question pretty well?
No, I think there's an internal answer and there's an external answer. Inside of the company, one attempts to create an atmosphere and ambience such that people feel as if they can flower and flourish regardless of what color they are, gender, and so on. Then externally, there's a role for MGO or other such institution in terms of its relation to the larger society. And that has to do with different kinds of programs, different kinds of efforts to try to be a good institutional citizen in the United States. I know you all are all over. I tend to think about Los Angeles and California when I think in Sacramento when I think MGO, but
here too.
You got people all around the world. Somebody from Long Island and so forth. And it's good God, you got to be a good institutional citizen in the United States and around the world.
Yes, that is very true. Okay, what kind of, can you share with the audience in your free time or in your leisure, what kind of music, movies, and books do you entertain yourself with? What do you what's your go-to? Could you give us maybe a recommendation from each category?
Ooh, that's so kind of you, darling. I don't have a lot of wisdom in this regard. I told you before, my dear sister Morgan, I'm old school. So I spend a lot of time listening to the dramatics and the delphonics and enchantment and the whispers and the main ingredient and the miracles, the temptations,
Yes.
the emotions, the Hutchinson sisters. I spend a lot of time listening to Carole King. I spent a lot of time listening to James Brown and the Average White Band, the brothers from Scotland who got funk, and Hall & Oates, as well as Carlos Santana. And then when you get to the jazz, of course, it's Coltrane and Eric Gardner and Sarah Vaughan and Johnny Hartman and Billy Eckstine and Dinah Washington and Ella Fitzgerald all the way down. Now, that leaves out a lot of the younger folk, a lot of the young. I mean, one of the things I'm sad about is I think it's sad that young people grow up, especially Black young people grow up without hearing young people singing groups in harmony and dissonance. You see, you don't really have dramatics or delphonics in the younger generation. You see, so that there's a lot of softness. You see, if justice is what love looks like in public, then tenderness is what love feels like in private. And part of Black history is acknowledging that Black folk, not just freedom fighters and love warriors, but we, at our best, we've been a tender people. Otis Redding say, try a little tenderness.
Yeah.
Bing Crosby sang that in the 30s, but Otis took it to another place. You know what I mean? Babyface, when he talks about Roni, it's a tender Roni. There's a sweetness, there's a kindness, and most importantly, there's a soulfulness, Sister Morgan. And soul ain't nothing but the sharing of a soothing sweetness against the backdrop of a dark catastrophe. See, that's what you get in the Temptations with David Ruffin's voice. That's what you get in Russell Tompkins Jr. and the Stylistics. That's what you get Ted Mills of Blue Magic. These are not just narrow entertainers. They are healing a wounded people with their sweetness and soulfulness to empower them to get up another day and have a dignity and a self-respect in the face of bombardment. And that's at that human level. You see, that's why you can get a Jewish brother from Minnesota named Robert Zimmerman that says, oh my God, there's some geniuses in Delta, Mississippi named Robert Johnson and Sam House. And I'm going to rename myself Bob Dylan. I'm still true to my Jewish roots, but I'm a blues man on the vanilla side of town because I want to get in on some of that tenderness and sweetness and artistry too, because they speak into something deep in my humanity that kindles my soul and makes me want to be a force for good. Let me sing a song for you. I got Blowing in the Wind for you. Ooh. Then Stevie Wonder going to pick it up, sing Blowing in the Wind. Ooh, now see, that's not just interracial solidarity. That's human connection at its deepest level that accents the best of who we are as human beings. And at that point, race becomes very much secondary, not because racism doesn't exist, but because the artistry takes us to a new level.
Mm-hmm.
We got Tony Bennett right now. He's got Alzheimer's. God bless him. You know, Tony Bennett, brought in by Pearl Bailey, he insisting that he's going to be wherever he goes, he's going to bring Count Basie with him. In the Army, he's got the black brother Frank, who he stands up for Frank, and he is punished because of his standing up for the black brother in the Army. Tony Bennett, a great artist, but also a force for good in which the racial divide never stood in the way of him being in contact with the humanity of others. And of course, we know his work with Martin Luther King Jr. and the others. And we can go on and on. You know, we can go on and on in this regard. So many great human beings, artists, and others that we can look to as sources of hope. And as you know, Sister Morgan, I am not an optimist at all. I'm not a pessimist either. I'm a prisoner of hope. And hope is a verb as much as a virtue. But hope is not a mood. You don't always have to be in a hopeful mood. Sometimes you ought not to be in a hopeful mood. When your mama dies, all of a sudden it's time to cry. It's time to have heartache. It's time to break down. It's time to wrestle with despair. But at the same time, you are aspiring to the virtue, being in motion. Keep on pushing, Curtis Mayfield said. Stay in motion to be a force for good. At MGO, when you get home with your family, when you're watching TV, when you engage in your social activities and so forth and so on, to try to somehow hold on to that integrity and honesty and decency that represents the best of any talk about diversity, inclusion, equity, democracy.
Yes. Wow. Who knew that a question about music, I'm sure the audience would reveal so much that we definitely needed to hear. So thank you so much for sharing. I have a couple of questions. I want to ask them because you said we have a couple of extra moments.
Oh, absolutely.
So I just want to let everybody know in the audience, we are going to continue with Dr. West. If you feel the need to drop off and have to go handle other work, this is recorded, so we're totally cool with that. But we have a couple of questions, and I think that really hearing from you would be more important than letting you go just because we can't ask. So
absolutely, that's fine.
From our CEO, Kevin O'Connell, he said, is our opportunity to create meaningful change as it relates to racial and social injustice greater today than it was in the past?
Tell my brother, I appreciate the question. I think that we're at a fork in the road in the country. There's no doubt about that. I think that what we've seen in the last 4 years is the escalating visibility of some of the worst in the country in terms of its racism and xenophobia and indifference toward vulnerable people and poor people and working people. But at the same time, we've seen a lot of the best in the country in terms of people who have been willing to come together across racial lines, either hit the street or engage in a variety of different acts collectively to accent these virtues that I keep coming back to: integrity, honesty, decency, and so on. And it's not, I don't think one particular group has a monopoly on it. You know, you've got some conservative brothers and sisters who, let's say, have been deeply concerned about unborn children and debate about abortion. And people rightly criticize them. Well, what about when the child is born? It looks like to me, if you're fundamentally concerned about the life of that child, you ought to be concerned about that life, the life of that child after it's born. So you get more and more conservative religious folk who are concerned about poverty as well as the unborn. Now, I happen to disagree with their stance on poverty, but fine. That's still a sign. That's still a sign of it broadening out your compassion. So then when you talk about poverty, what are the ways in which we can come to terms with making sure poor people have access to quality education, health care, and so forth and so on? So that I think we're at a fork in the road. You know, we got the worst and the best. That's escalating. Yeah. And let me say this, that your generation, Sister Morgan, has been much, much further along and down the road than my generation in terms of dealing with white supremacy, male supremacy, homophobia, transphobia, anti-Jewish, anti-Arab, anti-Muslim sensibility. I mean, and another way of putting it is really that when you actually look at the level of multiracial interaction and all the hybridity among young people in terms of the marriages, falling in love with different colors and so forth and so on, that kind of openness is much further down the road than was the case when I was coming along. Yeah. There's not about that. I think Brother Ken would probably agree with me. Well, no, I think Brother Kevin's probably much younger than me and Brother Ken. Is that right? Brother Kevin's a young brother. He's a young brother. That's right. Absolute. But the question will be that what you don't want to do is you don't want justice itself to become an idol. Yeah. So any justice that's only justice soon degenerates into something less than justice. Justice becomes an idol when it becomes a benchmark of self-righteousness, of one supposedly being on the right side of a cause without really having a deep love for the people you're concerned about. Mm-hmm. So that a lot of people can talk about justice in the abstract. Well, I want justice for Black people. But when it comes to interacting with the Black person right next to you, you feel insensitive. Yeah. Because you haven't made the human connection. You see, justice is about a deep care and concern and sensitivity to people. It's not just an ideal to wave as you march in the street. So I am concerned about justice, but there's got to be something deep. I mean, this is part of the genius of Hebrew scripture. You see, the hesed, the loving kindness, the steadfast love for orphan, widow, fatherless, motherless, persecuted, subjugated, dominated. That is part of the genius of Hebrew scripture. So it's not just about justice as an ideal norm, but it's a force in your heart, mind, and soul that makes you sensitive to the suffering of the weak and vulnerable, or what Jesus would call the least of these. Again, I'm a Christian, so I'm tied to a particular Palestinian Jew named Jesus, right? but he comes out of that Hebrew scripture. He comes out of prophetic Judaism. And so the question of that deep love and concern that cuts deeper than justice, that's what is very important to keep in mind. And that's what a lot of young folk need to keep in mind, because a lot of times they want to be on the justice train, but they're not really rightly situated on the love train.
That's very true. That is very true. Well, Dr. West, it is now 4:40, and we have one more question I really want to ask.
Sure, one more question is fine, Sister Morgan.
I'm gonna close it out, everyone. I'm sorry, I want to get to all of your questions, but I know we all have things to get back to. Okay, so this is from Barbara Webb. She is in our Chicago office, and she's a director in our tax practice. She said she studied your work in college and in graduate school and is so proud to be a part of an organization that is hosting you as a speaker. She would love to hear your thoughts on creating a corporate culture that acknowledges and respects the cultural differences without stereotyping, especially when it comes to training supervisors and managers how to conduct performance evaluations. So I think you got it, but I can summarize it.
No, indeed. No, and I think I appreciate the question from my dear sister in Chicago, but I think it's a matter of just kind of emphasizing what I was saying about making sure that the context in which we relate to each other allows us, on the one hand, to have a sensitivity and patience regarding our faults, but also has to be vigilant in a spiritual and moral sense in terms of accenting the concern of being sensitive and fair to others. And we've got to be able to walk that tightrope, that we can never give up on the vigilance of being committed to sensitivity and fairness. And at the same time, recognize that, we're dealing with human beings, and all of us as human beings, we have our own blind spots and faults and foibles. And those faults and foibles must never be rationalized or justified. And we should say, we as a nation, probably the major fault of the American empire is that the mainstream too often has viewed itself as innocent. Innocent. And when you're innocent, it means you never want to take responsibility. You never want accountability. You never want answerability. You see, when you're innocent, you feel as if that you're pure. You can always hold at arm's length the challenge and not listen seriously to the voices of other people who are calling for a sensitivity and a fairness. So it's like jazz musicians, you got to learn how to listen, and you got to learn how to play.
Yeah.
You learn how to play without listening. And if you're only listening and you just tuning your instrument up, you're going to have to play the thing.
Right.
You got to learn how to play it, and you got to learn how to play it together. You got to learn how to play it together. If Duke Ellington showed up all by himself, Brother Kevin will tell you, if Duke Ellington showed up all by himself, he could play a little solo for a while, but he's going to miss Johnny Hodges and the others. He's got a whole organization that he's working with in order to be a major force for good and do well.
Yeah. Well, Dr. West, our time is now up. And thank you so much again for being here with us, Dr. West. You're an inspiration to me, to my family, and to everyone else as we follow our dreams to make positive impact on the world. So thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a blessing to be in conversation with you, my dear Sister Morgan.
Yes. Next time, hopefully I'll get to see you.
Yeah, I know. No, this has been beautiful. This is beautiful, definitely.
Jen,
Thank you, Dr. West. Thank you, Morgan, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. On behalf of MGO's DEI and our presenters, thank you for joining us today and have a great rest of your day.